Hello, guys. Tonight we start with something a bit darker. An age of plagues, punishments, and stew. We dive into what life really was like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry that Hollywood sold you. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you watch from and what time it is there. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from different parts of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background murmur, and let's start tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you have just woken up in the year 1325. The good news is that you are alive. The bad news is that the fleas are too. Your bed is a half-rotten straw mattress full of bugs and hay that smells like a barn floor because 3 months ago it was a barn floor. There is no memory foam mattress, no pillows, and certainly no Egyptian cotton sheets either. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter and now weighs almost as much as a small cow due to accumulated dirt. You blink awake as the church bell rings in the distance. It is the medieval version of an alarm clock, only louder and, somehow, even less merciful. Your home is a wooden cabin with a single room, no windows, and a charming open-plan layout in which your family, livestock, and household insects share the same space. The smell, oh, it's a fragrant symphony. A subtle mixture of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you pray is not mold, but deep down you know it is. Scented candles have not been invented, and even if they existed, they would melt on the dirt floor. You try to stretch, but you immediately regret it, because the air is freezing and your joints hurt. You are 22 years old, which in medieval terms is roughly equivalent to middle age. Your spine creaks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like a bag of stones shaken by a disoriented peasant. Getting out of bed is a lottery. The floor is wet from the previous night's rain, which seeps through the thatched roof, or covered in scab from something your neighbor's chickens have done. In any case, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. Oh, and intimacy. What is that? Your whole family, and maybe some random cousin who has never left or waking up next to you. There are no bedrooms, no curtains, no time for you, just shared things. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never really alone because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you. And that's how your day begins. From here, it can only get worse. So you've managed to crawl out of your medieval barn of horrors. Congratulations. Now nature calls, and it doesn't call politely. It screams. This is where you start to miss the modern bathroom. There is no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, no cistern, not even a slightly resentful plunger in the corner. In the 14th century, doing your business is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a small public event. If you are a peasant, your bathroom is likely a wooden bucket behind the house, which is already full because Uncle Wolfstan had a difficult night after eating spoiled turnips. The smell is biblical. You hold your breath, do your needs, and then comes the best part. You throw it into the street. Yes, into the street. You're supposed to shout something like "Garde-à-vous" before throwing out the window. It is an old French expression that means watch out below, although, frankly, nobody moves quite fast enough. The streets of medieval cities are open sewers, a charming river of human waste, animal excrement, and mysterious liquids that you would prefer not to examine. If you're lucky enough to live in a city with public latrines, congratulations. You have to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outdoor toilet where privacy is a myth and ventilation a cruel joke. You can strike up a conversation, but try not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper, it has never been heard of. Most people clean themselves with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or, if they feel especially indulgent, with a piece of wool. Sometimes with nothing, which could explain why handshakes were not popular. And if you are in a castle, it is surely better, right? Well, more or less. You may have a wooden cup, a hole in the wall that leaves your waist directly over the moat. A great idea, except your enemies know it. And yes, attackers sometimes sneak through the hole. Speaking of entering through the back door, so whether you're a farmer or a baron, go to the bathroom in the Middle Ages is a humiliating ritual. It's cold, it's public, it's dangerous, and it's always disgusting. A slip on a wet stone path, and you end up with your face in humanity's remains. And you haven't brushed your teeth yet, but we'll get to that. You have survived the toilet. You deserve a reward, don't you? Maybe a good breakfast. Something hot, delicious, comforting. I'm sorry. This is medieval Europe. There is nothing comforting here. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is something gloomy. There are no eggs Benedict. There are no coffee makers that squeak when you wake up, and of course, no avocado toast either. You sit or squat near the fire with a wooden bowl containing something that looks like they had scraped from a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily ration of potage. Potage is a thick, sticky stew made with anything that can be found. Cereals, tubers, maybe a few beans if you're lucky. It has been cooking slowly over low heat in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, and new ingredients are thrown on top of the old ones. It is not so much a recipe as an ongoing edible experiment. As an accompaniment, a piece of bread so hard it could deflect arrows. It is made from coarse rye or barley flour, often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other creative ingredients, because wheat is a luxury for the rich. This loaf is not your friend. It is not cut into slices. You have to negotiate with it. And to drink? You don't drink orange juice or oat milk latte. You drink beer. Yes, beer. At 6 in the morning. Why? Because the water is full of parasites and dirt. So you start the day with a weak beer, with little alcohol and high survival capacity. Children drink it too. No one likes it, but at least it doesn't kill you right away. Do you want some meat or cheese? Don't even dream of it. That is for Sundays and holidays, only if your Lord feels generous. Most peasants eat meat only a few times a year. As for fresh fruit, only when it is in season and has not already been fermented into wine, and don't even think about spices unless you're royalty. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wage. Salt is so valuable that it's kept under lock and key. So you chew your gritty bread, swallow your medieval beer, and try not to think about the rat that may have nibbled your porridge during the night. Breakfast does not give any energy. It simply happens. And now that you are properly malnourished, it is time to work as if your life depended on it, because it truly does. So you have already had your sad medieval breakfast, and now it is time to get dressed. Not that it helps much. Your wardrobe consists of exactly a single set. 1. Is a thick wool tunic or linen dress that you have been wearing every day for months, maybe years. There is no seasonal fashion. You just have to wear the clothes until they disintegrate or cause a fungal infection. Underwear is optional. If you are lucky, maybe an inner linen tunic. If not, you go without anything under layers of rough, sweaty wool, lovingly sewn by someone who probably had no idea how a seam should look. There's also no washing machine, no soap, not even a dry cleaner. So your clothes are stained, stiff, and smell like a pile of manure that has been left to macerate in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash it, it is not easy. You would have to carry water from the river or heat it over the fire, rub your tunic on a board with ashes, or lie down and lay in the sun, which comes out approximately 3 days each year. And don't even get me started about shoes. If you have any, they're made of raw leather, barely sewn, and offer as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants go barefoot through the mud, manure, and medieval landmines, also known as sharp rocks and infected puddles. All this means one thing: your skin will hate you. It itches constantly. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs live on your body. Everyone has them. The nobles, the flea-ridden monks, the itchy children, the walking insect farms. No one is spared. You will scratch your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the town priest. And no one will blink. Your skin is raw from chafing. Your scalp is a battlefield of bites. And if you get a rash, well, too bad. There is no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to tell you that it's probably scabies. You just keep suffering, and if you're lucky enough not to get an infection, great. That rash will accompany you for the next 6 months as an unwanted medieval companion. Now that you're dressed in misery and wrapped in discomfort, it is time to go out and start working to death. Now that you are fully dressed in itches and damp wool, it is time to show that morning smile. Except you don't, because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a dangerous game. not emotionally, but dentally. There is no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, or dental floss. The concept of oral hygiene is as popular as bathing, which is not much. Some people chewed on a twig or rinsed with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, teeth were on their own and not doing very well. By your 20s, your smile looked like it came from an enchanted crypt. Cavities were widespread. The gums were inflamed. And those weren't just food stains on the teeth. It was decay. You had more rot in your mouth than a root cellar in medieval times. Sugar, although not yet everywhere, was becoming more common among the rich. Imported at great cost, it was mainly used in small cakes or to flaunt wealth. If you were of noble birth, congratulations. Your teeth rotted faster than those of the peasants. If you are poor, you'll do it slowly with fermented bread, sandy porridge, and years of chewing with difficulty. Toothache, get used to it. They were like the medieval climate, always there in the background. The kind of pain that makes you consider praying, drinking, or pulling the tooth out yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's no joke. That was the actual treatment. Dentists did not exist, but barber surgeons did. Yes, the same guy who cut your hair also pulled your teeth by candlelight with an iron hook and no anesthesia. Infected tooth. I hope you like fever, because without antibiotics, it could easily turn into sepsis and kill you from a toothache. That's just how it was. The same thing that takes us to the pharmacy today could be your funeral in the 14th century. And there was no relief in the social sphere either. Kisses? Good luck. Halitosis, or bad breath, was everywhere. If you were single, you weren't judged by your smile. You were judged by your lands and cattle. In short, your mouth was a battlefield, and you were losing the war. Now that your teeth hurt, let's go outside. Because your real job, the one that would break your back, had just begun. It's time for work. Except there was no office, desk, coffee break, or chance of promotion. Your job, if you were like 90% of the population, was simple. Don't die while working for the comfort of others. You were a peasant. Congratulations. That meant you worked the land that belonged to a lord who probably didn't even know your name. You got up with the sun and only stopped when it disappeared behind the trees. Your tools were a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and the bones still intact in your body. There was no weekend. There was no clocking in. There was only sunrise and sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday was free, but only if you didn't have to harvest, fight bandits, or pray fervently for your infected finger to stop turning black. The work was brutal. The fields were plowed by hand or with oxen, if you were rich enough to afford them. You dug ditches, sowed seeds, pulled weeds, and carried water until your spine began to resemble the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one asks about your mental health. If you are a woman, surprise. You don't just work in the field. You also take care of children. Clean, cook, spin wool, feed the animals, and pretend that your husband's lice infestation is not slowly migrating to your side of the bed. Children start helping at home from age 5. There's no school, no toys, just a small wooden rake and the dream of not dying of flu someday. And if you're one of the few who is not a farmer, maybe you're a blacksmith, tanner, or cooper, great. Even so, you work all day with fire, chemicals, or animal entrails in poorly ventilated sheds. The salary, basically what is necessary to survive. The advantages, bleeding from time to time, a broken bone, bad luck. If you have a fever, drink hot beer and keep going. You can't afford to stop, not even for one day. Because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. So you grab the shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job is not a professional career. It is a slow-motion test of endurance. Now that your back is burning from working in the field, let's talk about weather. Because in the Middle Ages, the temperature depends less on the seasons than on the continuous punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. There is no insulation, central heating, or weather protection. Only wooden walls with gaps big enough for a chicken. The windows are covered with fabrics, not glass. The fire in the fireplace, which in theory is nice, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it going because wood is expensive and collecting it from the forest is sometimes illegal. Yes, you could be executed for picking the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You wrap yourself in your only damp wool tunic. You huddle near the dying embers and still wake up with a frozen nose. Feet permanently cold, often wet. Your fingers are so stiff they look like little medieval poles. Freezing is not diagnosed. It's simply called bad luck. Now, let's fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Well, no. In summer, your house becomes a mud oven. There is no fan, no draft, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers of clothing, but you can't take them off because showing too much skin is scandalous and also causes sunburn, insect bites, and the flies are in full activity, attracted by your unwashed body and by the smell of last week's goat stew that is still fermenting in a corner. Mosquitoes buzz around your ear while you sleep, assuming you can sleep with the screams of your neighbors and the crying babies. In the fields, the sun scorches you. No sunscreen, no hat, unless you've made one out of straw like a desperate scarecrow. And worst of all, you still have to work. A heat stroke is simply called a bad turn. So either you're shivering in your own havel, wondering if your toes will make it to spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe. And the only thing that never changes, regardless of the season, is that the clothes are still itchy, the food is still horrible, and the next job is still waiting. Welcome to medieval climate control. It doesn't exist. Are you thirsty? Do you need to refresh yourself? Do you want to throw water on your face to wake up from this humid, feverish dream that is your life? Bad luck. In the Middle Ages, water was not your friend. It tries to kill you silently. Let's start with drinking. The nearby stream looks fresh, bubbly, and clear, as if from a fantasy movie. But beware, it is not. Upstream, someone just emptied a chamber pot into it. And if not that, there's probably a dead pig decomposing in it. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe await you in every sip. That is why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even children. But before you imagine medieval children doing handstands on barrels, keep in mind that it was light beer, with little alcohol, but strong for survival. Brewing beer boiled the water, so it was safer than the water that flowed through the town ditch. Wine was another option if you were rich enough to afford it and not worried about functioning properly before noon. And what about bathing? Surely water was used to wash. In theory, yes. In practice, not at all. You see, at that time, people believed bathing opened the pores and let diseases in. That is how it is. Washing was considered a health risk. Apparently, one was cleaner if one never removed the protective dirt layer that accumulated on the skin. Community baths existed, but they quickly gained a reputation as places of gossip, scandals, and, sometimes, full-fledged medieval extracurricular activities. So, naturally, the church intervened and closed many of them. Even if you wanted to bathe, it was quite a spectacle. You had to get water from the well, boil over the fire, fill a leaky wooden tub, and then pray that no one else in the house would use it before you, or worse, after. And rainwater was collected in open barrels where birds defecated, insects bred, and moss grew. Sounds refreshing, right? So, whether for drinking, washing, or watering crops, water in the Middle Ages was more a gamble than a source of life. One wrong sip, and you spent the last days of your life sweating on a straw bed, clutching your stomach, and reflecting on all the decisions you had made. The next time you drink tap water, toast to our ancestors. They did not have the luxury of hydrating safely, so you drank the water. Or maybe not. Maybe you hit your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. In any case, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is nothing more than polite torture with a theology degree. Let's start with the diagnosis. Everything that happens to you, whether it is a cough, rash, broken bones, or the spreading plague, is caused by an imbalance of your humors. The four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, your health depends on keeping them in balance, like a kind of internal soup. Do you have a fever? Too much blood? The answer, bloodletting. That is how it is. Let's drain your life force into a bowl with a dull blade or hungry leech. And yes, often barbers are the ones who did it. Imagine they cut hair and extracted hemoglobin in one session. 2 for 1, friend. Do you feel anxious or sad? Is clearly excess black bile? The remedy? Laxatives. Perhaps a hot herbal purgative or just prayers and a cold compress while everyone avoids looking you in the eye and starts carving your coffin. Now, if you break a bone or suffer serious injury, you're in a real bind. There is no anesthesia, unless you consider fainting from pain as anesthesia. The surgery is performed with knives that have not been cleaned since the Crusades. The tools are heated in fire, not to sterilize them, but because that way they're scarier. Antibiotics have not been invented yet, nor the germ theory either. They believe diseases come from stale air or God is angry with your moral failings. Does your stomach ache? It must be sinful thoughts. I hope you like confessing while vomiting. If your condition worsens, they will treat you with more leeches, possibly some crushed beetles, and have a priest by your side to give you the last rites, just in case. At this point, they prepare for the cure known as death. And if by some miracle you recover, everyone takes it for granted God has taken pity. The doctor takes all credit and the leech is promoted. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine is not so focused on curing as on surviving treatment. After a long day of work, lice, and leeches, it is finally time to eat. You crawl back to your vel, with your stomach rumbling, ready for the only pleasure you have left in life, a hot meal. Bad news. Your food is probably trying to kill you. Let's start with basics. Food preservation doesn't really exist. There are no refrigerators or freezers. Just salt, smoke, or hot winter air will keep food fresh. The meat, if you're lucky enough to have it, has been hanging for days, covered in flies, marinated in brine of dubious quality, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the basis of medieval diet, but not even that safe. In years of bad harvests, desperate peasants fill it with bark, sawdust, or even clay to extend it. And if it is rye season, there's an extra, the ergot, a fungus that causes seizures, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread mixed with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables, only if they're in season. And do you know what's always in season? Turnips. Lots and lots of turnips. Boiled, mashed, or floating in stew. Which, if you remember from Chapter 3, is basically a hot broth of mysterious ingredients cooking since your great-grandfather's funeral. In autumn, there may be fruit, but it rots quickly, and sugar is scarce, expensive, and hoarded by rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy products are another risky bet. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese last longer, but they are full of bacteria. People consume them anyway because, frankly, it's that or chewing boot leather. And let's talk about condiments. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg. More valuable than gold. For the average peasant, the flavor comes from the onion, the salt, if he is lucky, and the pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap, sprinkled with sadness. But food is not only a danger to your health. It is a political danger, too. The game animals belong to the Lord, not you. If caught hunting a rabbit, you can be fined, imprisoned, or executed. That's just how it is. Your dinner could cost you your life. So, when you sit down to eat your gray stew in the flickering light of the fire, remember that every bite is a risk. But you eat anyway, because in the Middle Ages, food does not nourish you. It tests you. It is already night. You have worked, you have suffered, and you have barely digested your suspicious stew. You might think that the day is coming to an end, but don't relax too much because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will denounce you without hesitation if you miss Massachusetts. In medieval Europe, religion is not just part of life. It is life itself. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education, if you know how to read, your birth, your marriage, your death, and everything else. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Every day is structured around prayer bells. The village church bell rings in morning, at noon, and at night. Not because people need reminders, but missing prayer is sin. Forgetting to bow. Sin. Eating meat on Friday. Sin. Thinking about your neighbor's wife in that dream. Double sin. And yes, hell is very real. Vividly real. The priests describe it in great detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with tridents, and eternal lamentations. If plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation will. You cannot read the Bible for yourself because it is written in Latin, a language reserved for monks and the clergy, for that noble child who is too good for the dirt. You depend on the church to interpret everything. That means that if the priest says that the bad harvest is because you have not prayed enough, well, it is time to kneel harder. Tithes, a 10th part of everything owned, are mandatory. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you have nothing, congratulations. You're spiritually and economically doomed. Holidays are holy days. There are dozens of them, and although they offer a break from work, they are not for fun. Therefore, one must attend Mass, fast, confess, and remember that joy is a dangerous whim. Questioning the church is dangerous. Heretics are burned, witches drowned, blasphemers whipped, and skeptics reformed. So one follows the ritual. He sings, he bows. You pray so that your soul, after enduring this life covered in dirt, can finally reach paradise if the priest likes you. Because in the Middle Ages, God could be merciful, but the church, not so much. If you thought being a medieval peasant was hard, try being one as a woman. All the dirt, hunger, and fear, plus childbirth, submission, and social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being a woman is like being in difficult mode, without health potions or a reset button. From birth, a girl's life path is practically traced. Marry young, have children, serve your husband, die tired. Education, unlikely. Unless you are from a noble family and sent to a convent. Your intellectual development stops, more or less, when you learn to churn butter and mend a tunic. Marriage is early, very soon. It is not uncommon to be engaged at 12 and pregnant at 14. It's not about love. It's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion does not matter. Once married, you're basically your husband's property. Your job is to give birth, feed everyone, keep the house in order, and not complain. Because complaining could get you branded as grumpy or, even worse, as a witch. That label comes with drowning or burning, depending on local custom. Giving birth is a deadly lottery. There is no prenatal care, no sterile instruments, or anesthesia. Midwives do what they can, but even minor complications can mean death of the mother, child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many do not. But don't worry, once the baby is born, your workload increases. Now you have a baby crying in a hut full of lice, and you are expected to take care of him, cook, clean, and continue helping in the field. You have no rest. You are everyone's rest. If you're not married, you are suspect. If you're a widow, vulnerable. If you're frank, dangerous. Women who did not conform to norms were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they had knowledge of herbs, a strong personality, or simply looked strangely at someone on a rainy Tuesday. Even in church, your role is limited. Nuns lived under strict rules. They could not speak without permission, had no freedom of movement, nor spiritual value. Always below men. In short, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, you were expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, if possible, with a smile. Because even in an era of universal suffering, women were expected to suffer with dignity. So far, you have fought against dirt, hunger, social injustice, and possibly a goat. But just when you think your day can't get worse, violence arrives. Noisy, bloody, and often completely acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages was not a peaceful time. The idea of law and order mostly meant hoping that the local lord was not in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere. At home, in the streets, on the battlefield, in church disputes, and sometimes in the queue for the communal bread oven. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice is more scenic art than protection. If you steal a loaf of bread, you can lose a hand. If accused of lying, your tongue can be pierced. If you gossip too much, you will be put on the bride of the foul mouth, a metal mask tied to the head with a bar in the mouth. To correct you, of course. Suppose you are accused of something serious. Heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? Torturing yourself? Obviously. Welcome to the trial by ordeal. In one version, You put your hand in boiling water to retrieve a stone. If it heals without infection in 3 days, you are innocent. If not, you are guilty. Another option is being thrown into a river. If you sink, you're innocent and probably die. If you float, you are guilty and will be punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival and the host actively encourages you to lose. And if you're sentenced to death, it's a public event. Executions are carried out before a cheering crowd, with hangings, beheadings, and burnings. Sometimes people bring snacks. It is the medieval equivalent of cable television. Domestic violence was completely normal. Husbands were allowed, and even expected, to punish their wives and children. Street fights were common. You could get beaten just for looking badly at a noble's horse. And war was always latent. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. There was always someone marching to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Violence is not a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. It is society. Everyone lives with the constant awareness that life is fragile, justice is arbitrary, and your neighbor could split your head open for a pig. So walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone with a club. At this point, you have survived lice, leeches, the misery of not being able to wash your clothes, and the imminent threat of being disemboweled in public. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, a premature and unglamorous death. If you are still alive and breathing after 40 years, you are practically a celebrity. They might even refer to you as the old man, which is less a nickname and more a statistical miracle. Let's analyze it. The average life expectancy is around 30 to 40 years, but that figure is greatly reduced by infant mortality. Almost half of the children died before they turned 5 years old. A disease, malnutrition, or a harsh winter was enough. There are no vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survived childhood, you reached adulthood already exhausted. Work began as soon as you could walk upright, and at 25 years old, your joints creaked like the door of a monastery. You could lose several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women faced an especially deadly test, childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. Without painkillers, without medical intervention, only with prayers, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled to death on a straw-filled cot. For men, the dangers were different, but equally relentless. Agricultural accidents, infections from minor wounds, the anger of a drunken neighbor, a crusade that went wrong. Even going to the market could be risky if you ran into a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could also come silently with the plague, which turned cities into cemeteries overnight, or with famine, which could last entire seasons and decimate entire towns. Or by bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your last hours hallucinating and screaming against the walls. And the funerals, you were lucky if they gave you one. Corpses were usually buried quickly to avoid disease. Without embalming, without polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow amount of earth, if there was enough space left in the church cemetery. So yes, in the Middle Ages, life was brutal, short, and constantly threatened by death in all its casual forms. You didn't retire. You simply stopped appearing. And speaking of exits, let's move to the final chapter. The medieval dream dies. How was your day? You have gotten up among dirt, you have done your needs in a bucket, you have brushed your teeth with illusion, you almost faint from hunger. You have worked until your spine has asked for mercy, you have scratched the wool that itched you, you have prayed not to contract the plague, and you have narrowly avoided a public execution for having a squirrel. Welcome to any day in medieval Europe. Do you still dream of becoming a knight? Think again. That idealized version of the Middle Ages. Gallant swordsmen, noble damsels in towers, heroic battles and banquets in large halls illuminated with candles. It is a myth polished by fairy tales and fantasy books. In reality, the medieval world was harsh, cruel, and deeply unfair. The hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you remained poor. If you were born rich, congratulations. You had more chances of surviving. But you were still one step away from dysentery and a hasty burial. Not even nobles were immune to misery. The castles were cold stone refrigerators full of fleas, smoke, and marriages for political reasons. Sure, you had a fur coat and a glass of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a skirmish or from infected splinter. It wasn't exactly luxury. The simpler times were not simple. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. Everything from giving birth to chewing had consequences. Life was survival, not leisure. And if you found a moment of tranquility to think, dream, imagine something better, you couldn't do much about it. There was no social mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to search on Google. What is this strange rash? You lived, suffered, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the most surprising thing. Despite all this, people kept laughing, singing songs, telling stories, falling in love, and finding meaning in life. Not because life was easy, but because human beings are so stubborn. Even in the darkest chapters, they made room for light. So tonight, when you get into your clean bed with running water, antibiotics, and central heating, maybe you can silently thank the modern world and your ancestors who fought against rats, hunger, and feudalism so that you wouldn't have to. Long before being Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, master of reform, and an icon of ambition, she was simply Sophie. She was born as Sophie Federica Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729. She was the daughter of a relatively unknown German princely family. Her small duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of power. But Sophie had something no title could provide: a razor-sharp intelligence, relentless charm, and a silent, burning desire for greatness. Her education was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating, not a warm and loving figure, but a status-obsessed climber. Sophie's father, a Prussian officer, was more distant than disciplinary. From a very young age, Sophie learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, spoke several languages, and learned to observe a room before speaking in it. Skills that would soon become survival tools in one of the most brutal courts in Europe. When the Russian Empress Isabel Petrona began looking for a wife for her heir, the Grand Duke Pedro, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Pedro was of German ancestry, and the Empress Isabel believed that a foreign, docile, and grateful bride would be easier to control. Sophia fit the profile perfectly. Noble blood, Lutheran faith, which she would be forced to abandon, and a reputation for grace and humility. At only 14 years old, Sophia was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the frigid capital of St. Petersburg in 1744, dressed in fine German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her forward as if she were a chess piece. However, Sophia had her own game in mind. In order to be accepted into Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Ekaterina Alexa Catalina. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and changed her life. She was not only changing religion, she was burning her bridges, entering a foreign empire with no possibility of return. No one who observed that quiet teenager with a fur-trimmed coat could predict what would come next: betrayal, revolution, illustration, and empire. But from the moment Sophie set foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began to plan how to become queen. Catalina's marriage to the Grand Duke, Pedro, aimed to secure her place in the Russian royalty. But from the beginning, it felt more like a cage than a crown. Pedro, heir to the Russian throne, was not the handsome prince of fairy tales. Clumsy, immature, and obsessed with toy soldiers, he was much more interested in playing war in his chambers than in ruling an empire or showing affection to his new wife. Some accounts even suggest that he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Federico el Grande of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had adopted him. In contrast, Catalina embraced Russia with fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized the Orthodox rituals. She wanted to belong in that place. Pedro wanted to escape. This mismatch was not only emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a viper's nest full of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. The Empress Isabel still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was in decline. Everyone knew that a transition was coming, and everyone had their own plans. Catalina was constantly watched. They read her letters, controlled her friendships, and examined each of her movements. She could not trust her husband, her mother, who kept whispering in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, not even her servants. In that world, alliances could turn into accusations overnight. But Catalina was not foolish. She learned to discreetly play the games of the court, cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed the military officers, befriended the scholars, and earned a reputation for dignity and moderation, in stark contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and his open contempt for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Catalina began to read enlightened thinkers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others saw her as a young consort, she was building a vision, not only for herself, but for Russia, a strong, educated, and rational nation. But there was a problem. The longer Pedro lived, the longer Catalina remained in limbo as a powerless wife of a man incapable of ruling. So she waited, observed, and planned. She knew that the Russian throne would not be inherited. It would have to be conquered. In 1762, after almost 2 decades of waiting, observation, and silent maneuvers, Catalina saw her opportunity and seized it with astonishing precision. The Empress Isabel had died, and Pedro, now Pedro III, was finally czar. But his reign began to crumble almost immediately. In just a few months, Pedro antagonized the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and profusely praised Prussia, Russia's historical enemy. He revoked key policies, humiliated the clergy, and openly spoke of divorcing Catalina to marry his lover. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, full of generals loyal to Catalina, murmured in the corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, saw Pedro as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Catalina, observing how events unfolded, decided to act. In July of that year, while Pedro was in his summer palace, Catalina launched a coup. With support from key military officers, including her lover, Gregory Olaf, and her influential brothers, she rode through St. Petersburg with pomp and was proclaimed Empress Catalina II, earning the loyalty of the powerful imperial guard. Pedro, taken by surprise and without allies, surrendered in days. He was arrested and soon after appeared dead in mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catalina was now empress, not by birth or marriage, but by will, wit, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign woman without any legitimate right had taken the throne of Russia without a battle. But her real challenge had only just begun. She had to transform that bold seizure of power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she keep the empire together without suffering the same fate as her husband? Catalina understood that power obtained through intrigues could be lost just as easily. She needed to govern not as an intriguer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from cautious conspirator to reformist empress. One that would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catalina obtained the crown, she could have rested on her laurels. But she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on the throne. She wanted to transform Russia, and not only militarily or politically, but intellectually too. While Pedro adored Federico el Grande and toy soldiers, Catalina idolized Voltaire and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of the monarch as a servant of the people, even though she ruled with absolute authority. Catalina not only read the philosophy of the Enlightenment, she lived it. She maintained direct correspondence with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Diderot to her court and even bought his entire library to support him. Behind closed doors, she immersed herself in legal texts, debated reforms, and developed policies to modernize the empire. The beginning of her reign was marked by efforts to codify Russian law. In 1767, she formed the Legislative Commission, an ambitious project aimed at rewriting the entire legal code of Russia. Catalina's own nakases or instructions were a covert political manifesto, which spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an 18th-century empress in Russia, it was something radical. But the ideals of the Enlightenment had to survive the reality of Russia, a vast, feudal, and deeply conservative country, ruled by nobles who liked their serfs to be exactly where they were, below them. Catalina knew it. Although she advocated reform, she acted cautiously. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to maintain their loyalty. This was the balance that Catalina achieved. A philosopher queen in public, a practical empress privately. She walked the tightrope between ideology and survival, between the bright halls of Paris and the star politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Catalina was not trying to Europeanize Russia. She was trying to modernize Russia on her own terms. And that meant reforms, yes, but with an iron fist and a velvet glove. Catalina was not content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. While Pedro the Great had opened a window to the west, Catalina aimed to tear down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia's borders expanded more than ever. She not only waged wars to defend her crown, but also to redraw Europe's map. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, were not only about territory. They had to do with influence. Catalina saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, and as the legitimate protector of Eastern Europe. Under the command of generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin, Russia conquered key regions such as Crimea, the north coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something that Russian tsars had coveted for generations. These victories were not only military, but symbolic. With each conquest, Catalina sent a message. Russia was no longer Europe's distant and backward cousin. It was a continental power. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of agreements and diplomatic maneuvers, Catalina participated in the partitions of Poland, dividing the agonizing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth along with Austria and Prussia. At the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland had disappeared from the map, and Russia claimed vast territories and millions of new subjects. But Catalina not only conquered with armies, she also colonized with ideas. New cities were built, trade routes were expanded, German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian lands. The empire became a mosaic that stretched from the frozen Baltic to the sunny Black Sea coasts. And throughout that time, Catalina remained the central force, reading reports, giving orders, and personally supervising the configuration of her expanding empire. Critics accused her of being ambitious, even imperialistic. But for Catalina, expansion was not ambition. It was destiny. She believed that a great ruler was measured not only by her ideas, but by her borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to turn it into a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its equals, and loyal only to her. Despite her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was equally famous for what happened behind palace doors. And no, not everything was whispered in libraries. Catalina's private life became one of the most talked-about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully selected parade, many decades younger, often handsome, and occasionally with political influence. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, properties, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were discreetly dismissed, sometimes with a courteous thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Gregory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was audacious. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe that they might even have married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin was not just a lover. He was her co-ruler in many ways. Even so, Europe could not overlook the scandal. The rumors skyrocketed. Satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, and even deranged. And after her death, the rumors only worsened. The most infamous was a completely false and grotesque story involving a horse, spread by her enemies to tarnish her legacy. But why so much obsession? Simple. Catalina was a woman who wielded power without qualms. And in a world where female rulers were expected to be holy virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play that role. She lived, loved, and governed on her own terms, and that made her a threat. Ironically, while her detractors painted her as immoral, Catalina had a deeply philosophical vision of love and sexuality. She believed that pleasure was a natural part of life, and that personal relationships did not have to threaten public duties. She separated emotions from government, something few male rulers achieved. In reality, her love relationships were strategic. She surrounded herself with loyal, capable, and politically useful men. And when they stopped being so, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Catalina's love life did not weaken her government. It was part of her strategy, a mixture of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. Despite all her charisma and control, Catalina's reign was not exempt from danger. And in 1773, that danger arrived as a bearded Cossack called Ilan Pugachev. He was not just any rebel. Pugachev claimed to be none other than Pedro III, Catalina's late husband. According to him, he had survived the coup d'état and was now returning to claim the throne from the German usurper. It was absurd. Pedro had been dead for a long time. But for the oppressed and exhausted lower classes of Russia, the affirmation didn't need to be true. It only had to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, the end of servitude, the reduction of taxes, and lands for the common people. His words lit the flame of rebellion throughout the Volga River region, especially among the peasants and the old believers of Ksak. In an era in which the gap between nobles and serfs had widened brutally, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev rebellion became the biggest peasant uprising in Russian history. Cities were taken, fortresses fell, and the nobles were massacred. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the empire would fracture. Catalina was shocked. It was not a foreign war that she could win with cavalry and treaties. It was a revolt of her own people, rising up against the system. She governed, but Catalina did not let herself be carried away by panic. She acted. She sent professional military forces to crush the rebellion without mercy. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, exhibited in an iron cage, and finally beheaded in Moscow as a public warning for all those who dare to follow him. Afterwards, Catalina redoubled the order and control. Her dreams of freeing the serfs quietly faded. The rebellion had shown her the limits of enlightenment in a country still chained to feudalism. Now she leaned more on the nobility, who offered her loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This was a turning point. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now gave priority to stability over philosophy. The reforms became cautious. Vigilance increased. Any rumor of rebellion had to be crushed before it could take hold. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left a warning that haunted Catalina. Power built on inequality could only last until the storm arrived. As Catalina the Great approached the end of her life, she had governed Russia for more than 3 decades, more than any other woman in the country's history. From the moment she took power, she defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under Catalina's reign, Russia became a true European power. Her territory expanded by more than 200,000 square miles, absorbing Crimea, parts of Poland, and extensions of the Black Sea coast. It was not only about military movements. They were strategic pivots, securing warm water ports and reshaping commerce. But her legacy was not only captured on maps. Catalina also left a cultural mark. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, gathered one of the largest art collections in Europe, and maintained correspondence with the most brilliant minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often considered backward by Western Europeans, Catalina placed Russia firmly on the cultural map. She modernized education, founded schools for girls, and promoted the printing of books. She introduced smallpox vaccination in Russia, even getting vaccinated publicly, an act of scientific courage at the time. However, her reign was also marked by contradictions. Although she admired the ideals of the Enlightenment, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom to deeper territories of Russia. Her reforms, although impressive, were mostly top-down, designed to polish the empire without truly transforming its foundations. Even so, Catalina's government brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not inherited, but forged, managed, and constantly defended. She did not govern by divine right, but by force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: manipulative, tyrant, reformer, seductress. But, above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was richer, bigger, and more formidable than it had been for centuries. She left behind a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a legend that would endure for centuries. Catalina did not just reign. She governed with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic control of history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. Despite all her power, expansion, and enduring legacy, Catalina the Great was still, at heart, a woman navigating a world of men and reshaping it in her image. Behind the imperial portraits and state decrees was someone deeply aware of how precarious her position was. She had not been born Russian. She came to the throne through a coup. She ruled an empire that did not want a woman in charge. And yet, she not only resisted, but thrived. Catalina never settled for being an ornament. She read constantly, wrote incessantly, and never stopped learning. Her daily schedule was intense. She spent hours reading reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state documents, and managing a court full of rival factions. She was not content to sit on the throne. She worked on it like a stateswoman born for it. She was also, in many ways, a lonely woman. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists. But in her memoirs, she wrote that there were very few people she could really trust. Her son Pablo, whom she did not trust and whom she kept away from state affairs, became a man who feared he could ruin all her achievements. Her greatest sentimental relationship with Gregory Pumpkin became a deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left her with a wound that never healed. Catalina took great care with her image. She understood the power of narrative and used it better than most monarchs of her time. She presented herself as the mother of Russia, an enlightened monarch, warrior, empress, and lover of the arts. But behind those roles, there was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, and had moved on. When she died in 1796, she left a transformed empire, but also many questions. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her enlightened ideals compromised by politics? Was she more reformer or ruler? History remembers her for the title she never gave herself, the Great. It was not because she was perfect, kind, or fair. It was because she took power and exercised it on her own terms in a time and place where women should not have it. She did not limit herself to wearing a crown. She redefined what it meant to earn it. In the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle, in southern Mexico, the ruins of Palenque whisper stories of the ancient Mayan world. Very tall temples rise above the canopy, their limestone facades eroded by time, but still brimming with secrets. And in 1994, one of those secrets was revealed. A team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, was inspecting Temple 3, a relatively modest pyramid located next to the more famous Temple of the Inscriptions, burial place of the powerful King Piel the Great. The Temple of the Throne was not expected to house much until they noticed something odd. A hidden and sealed chamber beneath the structure. No looter had touched it. It was intact. When the archaeologists broke in and entered, they found a stone sarcophagus resting in silence. The air was heavy with the weight of centuries. Upon opening the lid, red dust rose like smoke, a bright and surprising red. The interior was covered in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide used by the Mayans in ceremonies. And within that crimson cloud lay the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and reverence. Her bones were fragile but intact, her skull still wearing a jade mask, and her body surrounded by funerary offerings, necklaces, tiaras, and earrings, all made of jade and shells. Everything in the burial screamed royalty. However, no name was inscribed. No glyph identified her. It was one of the richest female burials ever found in Mesoamerica. And yet, it was a complete enigma. Why was she buried in red dust? Who was she? Was she a queen, a priestess, or perhaps even the wife of Pal? The researchers called her the Red Queen, and the name stuck. But not even with modern forensic medicine could they determine with certainty who she was, only that she had lived around the 7th century, during the golden age of Palenque. Unlike most Mayan tombs, hers had remained hidden, intact, and deliberately isolated. Her burial was not only ceremonial, it was spiritual. This woman was not meant to be remembered with words. She was meant to be remembered through rituals, colors, and the mystery she left behind. The most disturbing thing about the Red Queen's tomb was not her jade jewels nor the silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick layer of powdered cinnabar covered everything. The sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, even the offerings that surrounded her. It adhered to the stone like blood. For the Mayans, this was not a coincidence. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was one of the most sacred and dangerous substances in the ancient world. Its vibrant red color was not only striking. It symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force that connected the human and divine realms. Red was sacred. It was the color of dawn, of sacrifice, of life that arises from death. It was not only symbolic, it was spiritual. Covering the dead with cinnabar was a ritual intended to transform the body, preserving it not for eternity, but for transition. In Mayan belief, death was not the end. It was a step, a crossing to another cosmic layer. And so, the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not only for her burial, but for her deification. But there is another layer to this. Cinnabar is poisonous. Repeated exposure can cause mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, even death. The Maya probably did not understand chemistry, but they sensed its power. It was volatile, potent, dangerous. Bathing a corpse with it declared that person was not a common mortal. In Palenque, very few were buried with cinnabar. Pakal, the great powerful king whose pyramid dominates the site, was one of them. His body, like hers, was also covered with the red dust. That detail alone gave rise to much speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal divine status? Her skull had been placed on a jaguar skin, another sacred symbol. Around her, bone needles, obsidian blades, miniature jade figurines hinted at rituals performed during her life or in her honor after death. Each part of her burial told a story without any words. A story of power shrouded in mystery. A woman prepared to cross to the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony, bathed in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding the crimson-soaked remains of the Red Queen was a world of silence, broken only by the shine of jade, shells, and obsidian. They were not just ornaments. They were offerings, each carefully chosen to accompany her on her journey to the Mayan afterlife, Xibalba. At her sides were jade necklaces, heavy and cold, their polished surfaces still radiant after 1,300 years underground. Jade was not only beautiful, it was sacred. The Maya considered it a symbol of life eternal. It represented the green of the labyrinth, the jungle's vitality, and the breath of the gods. Only the elite were interred with jade. In the case of the Red Queen, it covered her chest, her wrists, and her ears, a clear sign that in life she had exerted influence, perhaps even divine favor. One of the most disturbing objects was a jade funerary mask placed delicately on her face. Unlike the gold funerary masks of Egypt, this one was subtle, built with dozens of small mosaics arranged to mimic the contours of her skull. The mask had a ritual function, to protect the soul, preserve identity, and present it as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. They could have been ritual tools or symbols of her status as priestess, healer, or royal matriarch. One of the bone pins had an engraving, faint yet significant, a small echo of her voice, lost in time. At her feet and along the tomb's edges were ceramic vessels, still sealed, which were probably once full of offerings. Food, drink, or incense to sustain her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed that the afterlife was a perilous journey, full of challenges and with multiple layers. These objects were not luxuries, but necessities. To summarize it, the tomb is perceived as intimate, unburdened, yet intentional. There was no gold, no chariots, no pomp, only objects chosen with spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we glimpse how the Maya understood death, not as an end, but as a transition of power. The Red Queen was not buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. Despite the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind a disturbing mystery. Neither her name nor any inscription adorned her sarcophagus. There were no glyphs on any walls that identified her. She was clearly someone powerful. But who? From the moment her tomb was opened, scholars began to connect the dots. The most compelling theory is that the Red Queen was Zak Kuknab, the wife of Kinich Janab Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palenque. Zak Kuknab was more than Pakal's consort. She was born into nobility and married into the royal dynasty of Palenque. At a young age. She had at least 3 children, all high-ranking, and played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone deserved such honor, it was her. This theory was supported by the location of the tomb, just a few meters from the Great Tomb of Pal in the Temple of the Inscriptions. The proximity suggests a deliberate union. Husband and wife, rulers even in death. And then there's cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palenque have been found with such intense cinnabar coverage. Pal and the Red Queen. It is unlikely this is a coincidence. But this is where the mystery deepens further. DNA tests were performed on both sets of remains, hoping to confirm the connection. But the results proved inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Pal, but that did not rule out a marital relation. After all, marriage does not require shared blood. Some have argued that it could have been Sakuk, Pal's powerful mother, who ruled Palenque before he came of age. Others suggest that she could have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost over time. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Taku Ao, a queen by title, mother of kings, and Pal's spiritual counterpart. The lack of a name may not be an oversight. It may have been intentional. In Mayan cosmology, the soul lived not through monuments, but through rituals, symbols, and whispers of the earth. And so, the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and truth. A woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from. A world in which Mayan women, especially royalty, had more influence than many believe. In Mayan civilization, politics was often a family matter. The women of royalty were not mere passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and mediators of power. They led rituals, sponsored temples, and played a crucial role in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Their lineages were political capital used to forge alliances and secure the right to the throne. Take Sakuk, the mother of Pal the Great, as an example. When the throne of Palanque became vacant, she took power and ruled as queen regent until her son matured. She was not a simple substitute. She was a ruler in her own right, enacting decrees and overseeing construction projects. Without her, Pal might never have risen to power. And she was not an anomaly. Throughout the Mayan world, in places like Yakilan, Nanzhou, and Calakmul, inscriptions show women performing important ceremonies, participating in war diplomacy, and, on occasion, ruling openly. They were often depicted in stele and murals, dressed in elaborate headdresses and royal attire, standing next to kings as equals or, at times, above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered until they were not. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that memory had faded. The colonial lens saw native women as silent figures in a world dominated by men. But archaeology tells a different story, one of complex gender roles in which power was negotiated, not simply inherited. This context sheds new light on the Red Queen. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and located next to Pal, suggests that she was a fundamental pillar of the royal order. Her jade mask was not just a decoration. It was a symbol of identity, of the power held in life and protected in death. Her lineage may have been the glue that held the Palanca dynasty together. In Mayan civilization, a queen was not just a queen. She was the guardian of the sacred lineage, the voice in ceremonies, and often the bridge between the gods and men. The Red Queen may not have a name, but she was never mute in her world. The Red Queen was buried with more than treasures. She was buried in architecture rich in meaning, imbued with Mayan cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design. Her tomb was more than a burial. It was a door to eternity. Her body was discovered inside the Third Temple, one of the smallest pyramids at the heart of Palanque. However, its proximity to the Temple of Inscriptions, the resting place of Pal the Great, is revealing. These temples were not randomly built. Its location was sacred, guided by astrology, myths, and dynastic legacy. The Third Temple rises modestly compared to its grandiose neighbor, but it hides something even more intimate. A sealed crypt, intact and perfectly preserved. It was built deep inside the temple, accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent to her tomb seems symbolic, a ritual journey to the underworld. The chamber itself is austere, made of carved stone, hermetically sealed for over 1,130 years. There are no glyphs or murals on the walls. There are no ornate carvings to tell her story. But perhaps that silence is intentional. This was not a space for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. In the center, her sarcophagus stands as a limestone altar. It is an echo of Pal's grandiose stone coffin, located next door. While Pal's lid is famous for its engravings with cosmic rebirth scenes, the Red Queen's tomb is sober. The attention is on the interior, on the body, on the cinnabar, on the death ritual itself. However, there are subtle architectural clues that hint at its meaning. The tomb is oriented from east to west, a symbolic path that reflects the journey of the sun from life to death. The chamber is small but powerful. It gives the sensation of being deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone revered. Mayan temples were cosmological tools, bridges between heaven, earth, and the underworld. Being buried in one meant rising beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home was not an afterthought. It was a carefully constructed sanctuary, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy in the architecture. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she was important. For the ancient Mayans, death was not an end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage to the underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual. It was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Funeral rituals were carefully choreographed events, rooted in myth and intended to guide the soul through the underworld's treacherous layers. Mayan texts and iconography tell us that Xibalba was not a peaceful afterlife. It was a labyrinth of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and death gods. Only those who were properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could make the journey successfully. The Red Queen was buried, wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings. All signs of an elite burial. But there is more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb suggests self-sacrifice rituals. These are possibly symbolic tools that represented rites she had exercised in life, or that were recreated in her burial to empower her spirit. The funerary mask, carefully assembled with jade tiles, was not simply decorative. It could have served as a spiritual vessel to preserve her face and identity as she traveled to the afterlife. According to Mayan beliefs, the face was the soul's mirror, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic containers that surrounded her could have contained chocolate, corn, water, or even pulque to feed her in the other world. Other objects like stingray spines or conch trumpets could represent spiritual tools, calls to gods, or symbols of ritual communication. The burial was more than a farewell. It was a transformation. The Mayans believed in cycles: death as seed, burial as planting, and afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often regarded as earthly incarnations of gods, and upon dying, they returned to their divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, buried in a pyramid, and honored with offerings, was being prepared to be reborn, not as a mortal, but as a being linked to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial was not the end to her story. It was the start of her legend. A few steps from the final resting place of the Red Queen is one of Mesoamerica's most emblematic tombs, that of Kinich Janabpal, known simply as Palenque the Great. His burial inside the Great Temple of the Inscriptions is famous for its art, scale, and deep spiritual symbolism. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb so extraordinary is not only what was inside, but where it was. Her sarcophagus was hidden inside Temple 3, right next to Pal's monument. In a city like Palenque, where each temple was carefully situated to reflect cosmic principles, this proximity was no coincidence. It was intentional, a statement engraved on stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Zakbuajah, the queen and trusted consort of Pal. Although her tomb lacks inscriptions, the similarities between their burials are striking. Both were wrapped in cinnabar, buried in pyramids, interred with jade, and treated with extreme reverence. These rituals are reflected in each other as if they were two halves of a sacred narrative. The lid of Palenque represents him falling to the underworld tree, a cosmic scene of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler tomb does not contain such iconography, but the symbolism resides in the couple itself. If Palenque represented the sun, which travels through the underworld during the night to resurface, then the Red Queen could have represented the moon, the feminine force that follows its own mysterious path in the sky. Together, they embodied a cosmic duality: masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Mayan mythology, power was not singular. It was relational. Harmony in the cosmos required balance, and that balance extended to the dynastic court. By placing the Red Queen next to Palenque, the Mayans preserved not only a marriage, but a cosmic association. Their proximity in death may reflect their roles in life. A queen not behind, but next to her king, sharing not only a throne, but also a legacy. In their tombs, they speak without words. Two souls wrapped in cinnabar and stone united for eternity. One of history's most sacred silences. Although her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the ancient world's most enigmatic and powerful women. Her tomb, sealed for more than 1,300 years, now whispers through the centuries, inviting questions that resonate more strongly with each discovery. She represents a mystery that still resists being fully understood. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph engraved with her name. No thief told her story. And yet, the care with which she was buried, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her bones soaked in crimson, all speak of a deeply important woman, not only as a wife or consort, but as someone who had true influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen compels us to reevaluate our assumptions. It is a reminder that, in the ancient Mayan world, women were not silent. They led rituals, ruled cities, and shaped dynasties. Although kings like Palenque have long hogged the limelight, the resurgence of the Red Queen reminds us that power did not belong only to men. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasure she left. It is the conversation that she started between archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Each jade bead, each layer of cinnabar, each architectural choice in the temple tells us something deliberate. This woman was important, and perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about her story. Not what we know, but what we still don't know. The Red Queen teaches us that history is not just a collection of fact. It is a living puzzle, a shared human desire to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy continues to grow. She lies wrapped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, which was once hidden behind a jade mask, now looks at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not without voice. Mysterious, but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something bigger, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And yet, somehow, she still speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant neighborhood of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. The Blue House, where she spent her childhood, was full of color, contradictions, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battlefield, and a museum for an emblematic artist of the 20th century. Frida was the third of four daughters of Guillermo Carlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderon, a devout Catholic of Spanish and indigenous descent. Her parents were opposites. Guillermo, reserved and intellectual. Matilda, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit the introspection and the artistic eye of her father, but also the fierce resistance of her mother. As a girl, Frida was imaginative, frank, and bold. She read voraciously and asked questions most adults didn't want to answer. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. A physical difference that she tried to hide with long skirts, but she never allowed it to limit her spirit. The disease left her bedridden for months and isolated from children. During this time, she became close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride a bicycle, and stay agile. Unlike most girls then, Frida did not aspire to become a wife or housewife. With the goal of becoming a doctor, she enrolled at the age of 15 in the prestigious National Preparatory School of Mexico City, where she was one of the few girls accepted. There she stood out not only for her intelligence, but also for her rebellious wit, her radical thinking, and her unique sense of style. She joined young intellectuals known as the Cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida felt drawn to the revolution, to ideas challenging tradition. But even then, before the bus accident that would mark her body and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with defined strokes, uncomplicated ideas, and an identity too big to fit into the expectations of others. She was not only growing up in Coyoacán, she was preparing to completely reinvent herself. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, after school, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Ares. They laughed, teased, and probably argued. Frida never did anything by halves. But moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar and, in an instant, Her future crumbled into pain, metal, and silence. The accident was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering the wood and throwing the passengers. Frida was impaled by a handrail. It went through her left hip and out through her pelvis. Her spine was fractured in 3 places. Her right leg was shattered. Her foot was dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs were broken. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen had been perforated. She was only 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed coat. Someone else noticed that her body shone, not because of the blood, but because of the gold dust that she carried in a bag. It exploded on impact, covering her shattered body with what looked like shiny ash. Frida was transferred to the Red Cross Hospital and underwent many operations during the following months. She spent weeks with her whole body in a cast, lying face up, immobile, writhing from infection and uncertainty. The future she had imagined, in which she would become a doctor, moved further away each day. But in that stillness, something began to awaken. Her father gave her some paintbrushes. Her mother installed a special easel for her to hang over her bed. They placed a mirror on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying between plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. At first from boredom, then from obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection, because it was the only thing she had. But what emerged was not vanity. It was survival. The accident had shattered her physically, but it had also opened a door for her. A door to her own mind, to her own body, and, finally, to the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began to heal herself, brushstroke by brushstroke. While Frida Kahlo lay wrapped in plaster and steel, a body that fought against itself with every breath, she began painting. What began as therapy soon became a language, and that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often difficult to look at, precisely the goal. Frida did not paint pretty flowers or pleasant landscapes. She painted pain, her pain physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she herself said in a famous phrase, "I paint myself because I am very alone and because I am the subject that I know best." Her first works were small format, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican challenges, devotional paintings intended to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition into something intimate. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions became the altar. She painted herself divided, pierced, bleeding. In one painting, she appears impaled with nails like a modern martyr. In another, she floats in an arid landscape, tied to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself crying, fractured, beheaded and naked, but never passive, always observing. Her pain was not sweetened. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, rebellion, and even humor. Each work was a vindication of her body, of her experience, and of her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida not only told her story, she was inventing a new type of visual narrative, one that mixed Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. When she recovered enough to walk again, albeit in pain, Frida was no longer the girl who wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen before. She had taken the worst thing that had happened to her in life and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo did not just paint her pain. She made the world see it, and, in doing so, turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and at only 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the deepest and most turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years older than her and already the most famous painter in Mexico. Enormous in both stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his far-reaching, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired him greatly, but now she wanted to know what he thought of her own work. She took her paintings to the Ministry of Education, interrupting his work on the scaffolding to ask him directly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took a look and replied, "Yes, and not only because of kindness." He recognized in her something unusual, a voice without filters, raw, unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was as passionate as it was creative. Frida once said, "I have suffered 2 accidents in my life. One was when a streetcar ran me over. The other one was Diego." They married in 1929, a strange couple to others. Diego, corpulent, unfaithful, famous in political circles. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate, yet chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter. But he was also infinitely unfaithful, even with Frida's sister, Christina. Frida was devastated and, in response, had her own lovers, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939 and remarried a year later under different conditions. This time, Frida would retain her autonomy, her house, her money, and her last name. Their second marriage was based less on traditional love and more on creative collaboration and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her deeply. He hurt her, but he also believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman capable of redefining what painting could be. Together they were not a quiet couple, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera on a trip north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad confronted her with American industrialism, the wealth and contradictions of capitalism, and left her with deep political unease. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her disillusionment. In a letter she sent home, she mocked the materialism and obsession with appearances of that culture. She missed the courage, color, and contradictions of Mexico. While Diego painted huge murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style was consolidated, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida did not paint herself out of vanity. She painted herself in order to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body constantly aching from the accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she withdrew into herself. Her portraits showed her bleeding, fragmented, and exposed. However, her face was always calm, always direct, without any remorse. One of her most striking works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying in a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss. A fetus, a snail, medical equipment, and a broken pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional. A canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in left-wing politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tijuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not only as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, body, and ideology were intertwined in her work. While Rivera painted murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost. The body in pieces, mind in flames, and the self always looking back. In exile and sick, she became not only a painter of pain, but of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something completely different, a force, an artist whose work radiated raw honesty, surrealist symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she fully rediscovered herself again. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacán became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow moldings, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots roaming freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a mixture of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earthiness. Here she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore daring Tijuana dresses, flowers in her hair, and painted between the aroma of copal incense and mariachi sounds of the street. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, symbolic, and political. Works like the two Fridas revealed a divided self. One with a European dress and bleeding heart, the other with indigenous clothes, strong and serene. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists such as Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood out. When André Breton tried to label her as one of his own, she objected. "They thought I was a surrealist," she said. "But I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the romantic version of postcards, but the living, throbbing country she adored. Her work overflowed with symbolism. Skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while unmasking the violence of her past and present. But although her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued its decline. The multiple operations, infections, and chronic pain became her daily reality. Even so, she continued painting, sitting in bed, with her torso held by corsets and fingers clenched around the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico, not to rest, but to regain her power through painting, politics, and courageous acceptance of herself. As the 1940s progressed, Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine deteriorated. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries throughout her life, often in exhausting succession. Sometimes she remained bedridden for months, wrapped in casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones. But she kept painting. Each canvas of those years became a liberation and act of resistance. Her works became darker and more challenging. She painted with clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphors. In the broken column, she presents herself divided in half, with her body pierced by nails and a cracked ionic column instead of her spine. However, her face is stoic and her gaze unwavering. Pain was no longer just a theme for Frida. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also grew stronger. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and denounced imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared at protests in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida had her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long-awaited celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile that doctors told her she could not attend. So she did what only Frida could do. She arrived in an ambulance, was taken on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery in her hospital bed. Dressed in her best traditional finery and surrounded by her own work, she received the guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire that still burned in her eyes. Her last paintings were both childish and heartbreaking. In Marxism will give health to the sick, El Marxismo dará salud a los enfermos. She painted herself with a steel corset held by the hands of Marx, getting rid of the symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of cut watermelons. One of the pieces bore the words, "Viva la vida," long life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, cheerful, and political. The last portraits of Frida Kahlo were not only self-portraits. They were revolutionary acts, painted with pain, but always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place where she had been born, La Casa Azul, in Coyoacán. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but her relatives whispered that there was more. She was sick, yes, but also exhausted by the pain, the operations, and the long war with her own body. A few days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala. Weak and in a wheelchair, she insisted on going, with her fist clenched high. The revolution remained her last heartbeat. The last entry in her diary was brief, yet moving. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope to never return. Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Arts, the most prestigious cultural institution in Mexico. Her body, covered with the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even though his betrayals had almost shattered her. But in the years following her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was only whispered in artistic circles. Her works were not easy to classify, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But little by little her image, her history, and her rebellion began to resonate. Throughout the 70s and 80s, as feminist academics and activists recovered forgotten voices, Frida's became stronger. She was no longer just a painter. She was a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born of resistance, a Mexican identity celebrated without complexes, of homosexuality, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, her unique eyebrow, her gaze, and the flowers in her hair became iconic. Her house became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text. And her paintings now hang in the most important museums worldwide. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow. But upon dying, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave paintings. She left a mirror and challenged us all to look at ourselves, not with pity, nor with fear, but with fire. Today, the face of Frida Kahlo is everywhere. Printed on T-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her characteristic single eyebrow, her crown of flowers, her direct gaze, all easily recognizable. But what makes her legacy so powerful is not only that people know her face, but that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida was not trying to be perfect. She didn't fit into the molds. She was not conventional, and she did not care. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us authenticity, a raw, chaotic, vibrant, angry, joyful, and contradictory authenticity. She celebrated what made her unique: her disability, her homosexuality, her political ideas, and her culture. She turned it into art that transcended borders and decades. She has become more than just an artist. She is a global symbol of rebellion, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she is a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and without complexes in an era that demanded silence. For women, she is a reminder that power requires no permission. For disabled artists, she is proof that pain can feed the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she is a recovered, fierce, folkloric daughter, an eternal part of the national soul. Her paintings, once rejected for being too strange or personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works such as the self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird and the broken column are not only seen. They are felt deeply by anyone who has suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived on the margins and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction. A communist who wore gold, a betrayed woman who loved again, a shattered body with an unbreakable soul. And despite everything, she painted not only with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, she told the truth of millions who had never before seen themselves reflected in art. Now, when we see her face, we see courage. We see color. We see resistance. We see Frida, who has not disappeared, but is immortal.